The problem isn't the truth itself, the problem is that the truth has weight. It's like carrying the entire library of human history on your shoulders, and you can't tell anyone what you know. Right now, I'm sitting in my truck, watching the sunrise over the Rockies, and every ray of light feels like a historical lie. My mind is screaming, completely reorganized by facts that shouldn't exist. It started 3 days ago, just a routine Tuesday night in my shop. I was trying to trace an electrical short on a '68 Ford F-100, the kind of job that usually takes 4 hours but stretches into 8. It was almost midnight outside my shop, about 20 miles from the nearest town. Just the normal sounds, the heater kicking off, the distant howl of a coyote, and the groan of the old corrugated steel roof. Then came the sound. It wasn't loud, not like a plane crash or an explosion. It was a single, heavy, wet thud, like something massive and flexible dropping into mud, followed by a quiet, high-frequency whine that cut out almost instantly. It felt too close. It came from the scrubland behind my scrap heap, where I keep the useless transmissions and rust buckets. I grabbed a flashlight and walked out. The light felt weak against the overwhelming dark. I navigated the tetanus traps of my own junkyard until I reached the back fence. That's where I saw it, a small crater, barely 4 feet wide, steaming slightly in the cold air. Embedded in the center was a fragment, maybe the size of a suitcase, of metal that wasn't metal. It glowed faintly, a soft indigo pulse. And next to the crater, slightly hidden by the dried corn stalks, was the entity. It wasn't moving. It was impossibly thin, standing maybe 6 feet tall, its skin reflecting the indigo glow of the fragment. It looked less like something that had crashed and more like something that had simply ceased functioning. It was still, dignified, and utterly alien. I stood there, frozen, the smell of ozone and wet earth heavy around us. I don't know why I helped it. Instinct, maybe. It felt less like a predatory threat and more like a massive, valuable piece of equipment left out in the rain. I managed to drag the fragment and stabilize the entity, it was strangely light, and get them both inside the garage. The cold radiating off the entity was unnatural, biting. I set it against my hydraulic lift, propped up like a mannequin. I examined the fragment. It wasn't titanium or carbon fiber. It felt solid but gave slightly under pressure, almost like supercooled plasticized oil. There were no seams, rivets, or welds, just one continuous piece of engineered material. My tools were useless against it. I pulled out my multimeter. Nothing registered. It was functionally inert, yet visually active. That's when it moved. Its eyes, those solid, luminous silver orbs, snapped open, focused directly on me. There was no flicker, no adjustment. Just instant, profound awareness. The moment those eyes locked onto mine, I didn't hear a voice, I felt a thought, a massive wave of information that clarified everything I thought I knew about the shop, the truck, and myself. It was overwhelming clarity. It pointed to the fragment, then to itself. The thought I received was complex, damaged, isolated, needs connection. It wasn't a physical injury. It was a systemic failure, a breakdown in whatever network allowed it to function. It wasn't wounded in the human sense, it was unplugged. And somehow, I, a grease monkey in rural Montana, was its technician. The entity directed my attention to a specific point on the jagged edge of the fragment where a connection had clearly sheared off. It wasn't a plug, it was a weave. It needed two things, a precise infusion of energy and a rare, stable metallic element to complete the circuit. It used my own brain to visualize what it needed, flashing blueprints I couldn't possibly understand. Where on earth was I supposed to find a rare earth element 7 alpha? I tried to project back to it, I fix V8S, man, not starships. But the entity was already directing my vision, focusing on a spot in the far corner of my yard, buried under 3 years of snow melt and discarded mufflers. It was an old, heavy-duty military relay box I'd salvaged years ago, thinking I might use the wiring harness. I dragged it inside, covered in grit and moss. The entity's gaze intensified. I pried it open with a flathead screwdriver. Inside, protected by decades of vacuum sealing, was a single, ceramic-coated capacitor. The thought hit me like a physical blow. This unit contains the required anchor element, stabilized by Terran military frequency shielding. I carefully extracted the capacitor. I felt less like I was making a choice and more like I was executing a macro command. The entity instructed me to place it directly against the broken edge of the indigo fragment. When I did, the capacitor, an object I knew to be stone cold, started to hum and warm up instantly. The indigo light around the fragment pulsed faster. The entity placed its hand over mine, palm to the back of my glove. The cold radiating off it vanished, replaced by an intense, electric warmth. I didn't feel power, I felt data dash. It was transferring the necessary charge, not electricity, but configuration code, directly through the component. My arm vibrated fiercely. The capacitor was absorbed instantly. The indigo glow stabilized to a soft, constant blue. The fragment was repaired. The entity removed its hand, and the sudden silence felt deafening. It then gave me a final directive: lift the fragment and place it back where I found it, next to the initial crater. I put the fragment down. The moment it touched the earth, it ceased glowing entirely. The entity stepped away from the garage, moving with that unsettlingly slow, perfect grace. It stood over the spot where the indigo shard had been, and it looked directly at me. Its silver eyes were burning with light, demanding my full attention. I heard the voice in my head, now crystal clear: the system is restored. I was isolated from the archive by regional interference. Your intervention was essential. The Terran component provided the necessary anchor for resynchronization. It spoke of systems, archives, and regional interference, like I had just rebooted an interstellar modem. Then came the offer. You provided assistance crucial to navigation. Recompense is required. You may not retain artifacts, but you may retain knowledge. I felt no compulsion to take anything, but the idea of a knowledge, real knowledge, not textbooks, was irresistible. I simply thought, yes. The transfer wasn't like watching a movie. It was instantaneous conceptual comprehension. My brain didn't process images, it processed truth. Billions of years compressed into a second. I saw the Earth not as a planet of evolution, but as a deliberate agricultural experiment, seeded and monitored periodically by entities like the Navigator. I saw every significant historical event, every great religious founding, not as mystical occurrences, but as maintenance visits. The prophets were the last humans who retained enough genetic integrity to communicate with the navigators before descending into the current low-level communication cycles. The entire story of civilization is just one long, confusing transcript of failed instructions. What we call religion is a deeply corrupted user manual. The entity showed me that the very elements of Terran life are modifications designed for an earlier harvest cycle, now overdue. The concept was staggeringly simple and horrifyingly complex. The data transfer ended as abruptly as it began. The entity took one slow step toward the crater site, its focus entirely internal. Synchronization is complete. Departure is required. Thank you, Caleb Vance. Hearing my name, spoken or thought, with that level of cosmic recognition, felt like an ordination. The indigo fragment, still inert, began to disintegrate slowly, turning into fine, sparkly black dust that dissipated into the atmosphere. Then the entity itself blurred. It wasn't a flash or an explosion. It simply phased out of existence, molecule by molecule, leaving behind no scent, no thermal trace, and no footprints in the wet earth. Only the shallow crater remained. I went back inside and finished the short circuit on the F-100. It started right up. But the knowledge is still there, integrated into my consciousness like a new operating system. I see the wires and I know they are temporary. I see the mountains and know they are artifacts. I am just a mechanic, but I fixed an interstellar link, and now I know that everything, every law, every belief, every structure, is based on a profound misunderstanding. I fixed the ship, but I broke my own mind. And I can't ever unknow it. The feeling wasn't visual, it was knowledge. A massive, incompressible data dumped directly into my consciousness. I saw the truth of the solar system, not as science teaches, but as history. Our history. It felt like my mind was being peeled open, and every concept I ever held sacred, religion, philosophy, civilization, was being recategorized in real time. My heart was hammering, not from dread, but from sheer, incomprehensible awe. That was the climax, but it all started 3 days before, just another scorching July afternoon out in the Arizona high desert. I run a little independent mechanic shop, mostly fixing old pickups and tractors for the ranch hands. My life is usually grease, dust, and predictable engine noise. The only thing out of the ordinary was my shortwave radio setup. I'd built it years ago as a hobby, trying to pick up distant weather satellites. Lately, though, it had been spitting out something entirely new. Not static, not Morse code, but a perfectly smooth, rising tone that lasted exactly 14 seconds every hour, on the hour. I tried locating the signal source using crude triangulation, driving my old pickup out to the coordinates. The signal was focused, tight, and getting stronger the closer I got to the old abandoned military range, 50 miles deep in the reservation land. That land is sacred, and officially, you aren't supposed to be there. When I arrived, the landscape was fine, no crater, no smoke, nothing like a conventional crash. Just sand, scrub brush, and an overwhelming sense of pressurized silence. The tone hit max volume on the receiver. I got out and started walking. That's when I saw the anomaly. It was barely buried, maybe 6 inches deep. I started digging with a shovel I keep in the bed. The metal was unlike anything I had ever touched. It was warm, smooth, and seemed to actively repel dust. It had no seams, rivets, or visible entry points. It looked less like something built and more like a gigantic, perfect black pearl. I spent the entire night hauling the thing back. It was surprisingly light for its size, about the size of a small sedan but weightless, maybe 400 pounds total. I covered it with a tarp and dragged it into the darkest corner of my garage. I couldn't tell anyone. This wasn't some government experiment, this was fundamentally alien. The next morning, I was exhausted but wired. I started examining the ship. The seamless surface finally yielded when I focused a specific frequency of radio waves onto it. A section of the shell simply dissolved, revealing a humid, dimly lit interior, smelling faintly of ozone and old copper. Inside, nestled in what looked like a biological cradle, was the being. It was metallic gray, skeletal, and absolutely motionless. It wasn't dead, but it was operating on emergency power. Those massive, oily black eyes were open, fixed on the ceiling, not on me. It was malfunctioning. I realized the persistent signal wasn't a beacon, but a power drain indicator. It was trying to sustain itself. I carefully reached in and examined the panel near its head. It wasn't wires and circuits, it was pulsing, crystallized energy grids. One section was dark, shattered, and bleeding a faint, acrid vapor. I'm a mechanic, not a physicist, but I understood the concept of a closed loop. If I could bridge the gap, I might stabilize the system. I had some specialized induction welding wire, extremely pure copper. I didn't know if it would work, but the alternative was watching it fade. As I carefully fed the copper into the damaged crystal matrix, a voice echoed in my head. It wasn't sound, it was meaning. Help us. Repair the path. It was calm, devoid of emotion, and totally overwhelming. It stopped me cold. I had confirmation, it was sentient, and it was asking for help. I resumed the repair, hands shaking. The copper fused instantly with the alien material, not melting, but integrating. The dark section of the crystal lit up with a brilliant blue-white pulse. The rising tone on my shortwave radio instantly cut out. Silence. Complete, deep silence. The being moved. Slowly, deliberately, its head turned. Those deep black eyes focused on me. And then the communication started again. Much clearer this time. You have stabilized the vessel. The cargo is secured. Cargo? It wasn't just a pilot, it was a courier. I mentally asked, what is the cargo? The answer was immediate and shocking. The data matrix. The accounting of your origins. We were seated here. You were tailored. The vessel was an emergency storage unit, protecting data critical to the history of Earth. The being informed me, without judgment, that its mission was over. It had succeeded in stabilizing the data long enough for a transfer, but its physical form couldn't be sustained. It then offered the data to me. You repaired the path. You are the only one capable of holding this now. I didn't say yes, but I didn't say no either. I felt a profound sense of destiny, like I had been preparing for this moment since I first picked up a wrench. I stood there, right in the middle of my dusty, mundane garage, waiting for the universe to explain itself. The energy surged. It wasn't painful, but it was absolute. My vision went white, then became maps of DNA, swirling nebulae, and mathematical equations so elegant they made music obsolete. I saw the primordial oceans and the careful placement of the genetic keys that unlocked humanity. I understood the true nature of the gods our ancestors worshipped. They were not deities, but genetic engineers, tending their planetary gardens across the spiral arm of the galaxy. Our purpose was not spiritual salvation, but long-term data storage and evolutionary observation. The transfer lasted what felt like hours, compressing millennia of cosmic information into my brain. When it stopped, I was drenched in sweat, but completely lucid. The clarity was shocking. Every question I had ever had about existence was answered, and the answers were technological, not divine. I looked back at the ship. The being was gone. It hadn't dissolved or teleported. Its physical form had simply ceased to be relevant after the data transfer. The metallic gray body was still there, but it was inert, an empty shell, like a discarded chrysalis. The ship, having completed its final function, closed the hatch instantly, returning to its perfect, seamless sphere. The copper wire I used to save it was absorbed into the structure. It was whole again, but silent. It looked ready to wait another million years. I knew then why I had been chosen. Not because I was special, but because I was isolated, and my skill set matched the specific failure mode. I was just a mechanic who happened to bridge a gap between species, and in return, I was given the instruction manual for the cosmos. Now, I still fix trucks and tractors. I still live in the desert. But everything is different. When a rancher talks about faith, or when I see a news report, I know the truth. I walk among people whose consciousness was engineered by beings I repaired, carrying the knowledge that the universe is infinitely more complex, and infinitely less spiritual, than anyone suspects. And I am entirely alone with that truth. I can't look at water the same way anymore. Or soil. Or the sky. It's been 3 days since the transfer, and my brain feels like a server farm running 12 simultaneous operating systems. I know things I should not know, things about prehistory, about true theology, about the physics that govern light itself. I understand the cosmic joke, but it wasn't funny. This profound knowledge. It started with a broken capacitor, deep in the Texas Hill Country. Flashback to last Tuesday. I run a custom fabrication shop out of my home in Comfort, Texas. I usually work on classic cars, sometimes industrial repairs. It's quiet, just the hum of my machinery and the occasional coyote howl. That week was supposed to be easy, tune up a 72 Blazer and maybe install a new lift. The normalcy of it is important. That's why I remember every detail. I was tightening the manifold bolts when the lights flickered. Not a power surge, the kind of stutter electricity makes when something monumental is drawing too much juice from the local grid. It only lasted maybe 10 seconds. Later that night, the sound started. It was too low to be heard, but I felt it. A subsonic vibration thrumming through the concrete foundation of the garage. It felt like standing next to a massive, idling engine that was entirely out of sync. I walked outside, flashlight in hand, thinking a transformer blew up. The air smelled like ozone and cut grass, a weird combination. I followed the vibration across my property, past the shed, until I reached the edge of the woods line. That's where I found it. It wasn't a crash site. There was no smoke, no broken trees, just a clean, circular indentation in the soil. And sitting right in the middle of that circle was the entity. Coiled up, inert, like a massive, sophisticated silver spring that had just stopped winding. It wasn't threatening. It was still. It felt less like a creature and more like a dropped piece of complicated jewelry, but utterly alien. I spent a ridiculous 20 minutes just staring. My mechanic brain started kicking in. If something stops working, it's usually because a connection is broken. I saw no seams, no bolts, but I noticed the light coming from the central hexagonal lens was irregular, like a dying battery trying to ignite. I decided to move it. Using my hydraulic engine hoist, it was heavy, dense, maybe 400 pounds, I transferred it carefully to the largest steel workbench in the garage. I draped thick welding blankets over the windows. I didn't want neighbors asking questions about my new silver sculpture. Under the bright work light, I saw the damage. It wasn't a dent. Along one of its segmented coils, there was a minute disruption, a tiny square, less than a millimeter wide, where the metallic sheen was dull and gray, not shifting blue-green. It was a failure point. A short circuit, maybe. That's when the communication started. It wasn't language. It was a cold, pure pressure in my skull, not painful, just demanding attention. It felt like an equation being solved in real time. Look here, analyze this function, I require a stabilization current. The pressure directed me toward a specific spot on my workbench, my old parts bin, the one full of ancient, salvaged components I keep just in case. It needed something specific. Something I'd last used on a vintage amplifier from the 1960s. A vintage tantalum capacitor. They are renowned for handling extreme spikes and providing steady power stability. But why would a civilization that traveled light years need a 40-year-old Earth capacitor? The answer that pressed into my mind was simply compatibility. Only Earth technology works on the flaw. It was like asking me to fix a quantum computer with a screwdriver. But the cognitive direction was so clear. I had to create a temporary bridge across that gray, dull flaw using the capacitor to regulate the energy bleed. It was a temporary patch, but essential. This was the point of no return. I cleaned the connection points with specialized solvent. The metallic surface of the entity felt cool and utterly smooth, resisting any attempt to file or score it, except for the tiny, dull flaw. It accepted the heat of the soldering iron instantly. The moment the connection was stable, the sound returned, but intensified. It wasn't just subsonic vibration now, it was harmonic resonance. Every metal object in the garage started to sing at a pitch too high to register. The air pressure dropped noticeably, and I felt dizzy. Then the entity uncoiled. Slowly, deliberately, revealing its full length. It pivoted its hexagonal lens towards me. There was no feeling of threat, only an immense, calculating gratitude. And then, the download started. It was overwhelming. Sensory input beyond description. I saw time as a dimension, not a sequence. I saw the true geometry of the universe, and it was infinitely simpler than we imagine, yet fundamentally unattainable by human math. I saw the first spark of humanity, not evolution, but an extremely complex engineering project. The feeling was absolute certainty. The information settled in my brain like a new, permanent layer of reality. We are children playing in a yard designed for giants. Every major religion, based on highly flawed, third-hand interpretations of maintenance reports left by the engineers. It lasted exactly 90 seconds. When it stopped, the blue light vanished. The entity retracted its coils, becoming that quiet, inert shape again. The air pressure returned to normal. Everything was silent, except for the ringing in my ears. The entity moved itself. It vibrated slightly, lifting off the workbench, peeling the tiny tantalum capacitor clean off its surface. It was no longer needed, and dropped it onto the floor. It floated silently toward the garage door. I didn't try to stop it. I was overloaded. The garage door opened silently, without the usual rattling of the chain drive. The entity slipped out into the pre-dawn darkness. The door closed behind it. The circular indentation in the field was gone when I checked later. I tried to sleep afterward, but how do you rest when you know the entire history of water on Earth? My mind is constantly running diagnostics on the universe now. The worst part isn't the truth, it's the inability to explain it. It requires a foundational shift in vocabulary. I look at my tools, my wrenches, my plasma cutter, my gauges. They seem pathetic, yet one tiny component from this toolbox was critical to fixing an interstellar machine. It suggests our mundane existence is far more significant than we realize, or maybe just incredibly specialized. I can't unlearn it. I'm just Alex, the mechanic from Comfort, Texas, except now I know that everything we believe is wrong, and I have the schematics for the universe in my head. And the loneliness? It's paralyzing. Because who do you tell that the foundation of our civilization rested on a 40-year-old capacitor?